CI Capital Research, who we are. We're a team of 20 people based in Cairo, and we mix a lot of industry and company data. What is research? Research is basically content and an increasingly commoditized version of that. Thankfully, in Africa and Egypt, you can still be the one-eyed man of the blind. So we have data of 100 companies in Egypt across many different sectors and actively cover close to 50 of those. So we get a very big view from the bottom up as well as looking top down in the country. And for that reason, and because we get enthusiastic about the prospects that are going on in Egypt, which I'll explain very briefly, then we use that content in many different ways for many different clients. And so as part of CI Capital, we've opened up the Silk Route again. We take Egypt to Asia, and we try to bring Asia back to Egypt. We often work with the Ministry of Finance to go around and talk to sovereign wealth funds, to private equity investors, to corporates who want to invest in power plants and such like. So research is actually used, and that content is used for a big client base, which ranges from the internal investment bank to the strategy and credit departments of our own bank, and to foreign corporates looking in, as well as, of course, our bread and butter, which is the broking community of the retail investors in Egypt, so the institutional investors in Egypt, the institutional investors around the Gulf, and of course in this part of the world and in Europe. So what is that story, and why Egypt? Well, in a nutshell, if you start from up in the stratosphere, you see it has a fantastic location. It sits on all these trade routes, and as you go down to this corner of Africa, you also see that it's tied up some quite advantageous trade agreements, particularly with Europe, but also is playing a full part in the CAMISA agreements. So in a way, it's a gateway to Europe, it's a gateway to Africa, and it's a gateway from Asia into Europe, which makes it an interesting location. As you get nearer down, it's got 80 million people. Most of those, around 46%, are in the productive capacity already. It's a very young and fast-growing population, which is a strain, but also a big opportunity. It's a low-cost producer in its region. Energy costs are low, unit labor costs are low, productivity is also a little low, but that's improving. And it's all very interesting. You get this mix of demographics, cost, and location. And what then comes on has been a very active government program that's brought tax down to a uniform 20%, for example, and year by year is highly ranked as one of the best performers in terms of improving the access for investors. It still has a long way to go. It's still ranked quite far down, but it's improving year by year, and this is a catalyst for growth. So really what you get, and what we tell investors, is that you're getting this mix of demographics, location, low cost, plus a catalyst, and that means growth. Where the proof of that has come is if you look through this big downturn since 2008, GDP growth fell from 7% down to just over 4%, and is now rising up to around about 6%. So it's had constant growth year on year that has been above average for the region and certainly above average for the globe. Then, as you drill down further and you want to be an institutional investor looking at Egypt, well, first of all, I can just quickly mention some value statistic. You're getting, as a market from the bottom up, you're probably getting close to 20% earnings growth coming in the next couple of years, and you're paying around about 11 to 12 times forward earnings for that. So it's no longer screamingly cheap, but it's actually quite relatively cheap for the growth stories that you can find around the region. What do you then invest in? Everything needs doing. You take a pot. Basically, you're developing internal trade from north to south. You're developing complete new towns. There's around about, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, something like 500,000 houses that are needed every year that, in terms of the building gap. There's a rise in consumerism that goes on. So you can take a chunk from, let's call it construction and infrastructure. So you need cement, you need steel, you need construction. On the other side, on the consumer, you need housing, you need the white goods, you need the cars and such like. The nice thing about the Egyptian Stock Exchange is it's a very well spread. It's not just banks and real estate. You can buy any industry and pick out of that. So I'll leave it like that. You've got you've got, from the top down, you've got a very interesting story, and you've got a value story, and you can invest in lots of different areas of that in liquid stocks. That's the message we give to investors, and if you want to talk about that in more detail, I have presentations and such like, as you might expect, to sell you my unsuspecting wares. We've tried to look for new markets and follow business flows, and that took us to Asia. In Asia, it's a provision of information. One of the things that we have our competitive advantage is entirely Egypt, and we're your friend in Egypt and a person on the ground. What we found from the 2008 downturn is a lot of Egyptian companies were looking straight into Europe or to the US, started to look around their home market and into the surrounding African markets. There's a higher margin business, but also for longer term growth. So as Karim says, they started to move into that markets. The other interesting thing that started to happen was, having sold an Egyptian story to some unsuspecting Korean bank, you get asked about Africa. We do bespoke research for people. So at that point, we go off and we look at the Moroccan market or the Tunisian market, or actually Mauritius as well, for specific people looking at things. But the last thing to say about CI Capital, and you're missing a networking trick here, is we don't presume to really know those markets. We look to work with the equivalent of us in those markets. We try to find those champions and partners so that we can network and access those flows, and by that way expand through Africa.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.